Hello, everyone, and welcome to another PropMoto webinar. As always, I will be your moderator. I am Franco. I'm the editor and co-founder of PropMoto. Today, we're going to be talking about cost-saving solutions for energy management in corporate real estate. So really excited to chat about what is a bit of a difficult subject, I think, for some building owners and corporate real estate professionals. I think right now, obviously, we're trying to understand the office, what we're using the office for, what's the value of the office. Part of the conversation we'll get into a little bit later, but I think as we are understanding that, we're also looking for ways to, reduce costs of the office, right, and possibly shrink offices for a lot of organizations. So just understanding really how it fits into their portfolio and how it helps their organization, and obviously how to make the best ROI, which means driving costs down. As always, this is going to be, this is live. Anything can happen, and we are going to be taking your questions live here. So as we're talking, if you guys have something to say, something to ask, please throw it in the chat here. We have some chats and a Q&A. Also interested to hear where everyone's from. I know, I see some of the emails come in when they log in. So I know you guys are from all over the country and even the world. So if someone here has they would love to jump in and tell us where they're from. So it's great to know exactly where we're talking to people. Obviously, some of you in Europe probably getting pretty late over there, but for everybody else, happy Tuesday. And yeah, looking forward to having a really great conversation here about just exactly how costs can be brought down and what that means, right? I think there's also making sure that driving costs down doesn't reduce the usefulness of the office, right? Because at that point, it doesn't really make sense. So without further ado, I would love to introduce my expert panelists here. First, I have Elizabeth Redmond. She is Senior Director of Sales at R0. That's a smart building technology company. Hi, Elizabeth. Next,
Hey,
we have,
Franco.
and good to have you, thanks. Next, we have Emily Watkins. She is Chief Client Officer at the Instant Group. They are a flexible workspace advisory service. Hi, Emily, how you doing?
Hello, great. How are you?
Good, thanks for joining again. Emily here has been on a few of these and always knocks out of the park, so great to see you again.
You too.
And last but not least, we have Brendan Hermelin. He's founder of Thalo Labs. It's a climate tech company focused on reducing emissions. So hi, Brendan. Thanks for joining.
Great to be here, Franco. Looking forward to it.
So I always like to start a little bit with a state of the market, right? You guys have clients that are in, office real estate, corporate real estate, and you're kind of seeing what's happening. And just kind of wanted to go around the horn and just tell me a little bit about, what you're hearing from your clients, what kind of stuff you're working on, and what's really top of mind. I know that, the office market has been in a state of flux for a long time. We've said, had so many of these webinars where, things are changing. We're still trying to figure out the office. And I'm kind of getting a sense that we're getting there, right? I think that people are, companies are finally kind of figuring out the value of the office, what that they do need an office, right? I think the hyperbole of, offices are dead, remote work's going to take over has certainly subsided. So yeah, I'd love to just hear a little bit about some of the people you're working with and just general trends that you're seeing. Brendan, why don't we start with you? What are you seeing out there when you're talking to some people, your clients?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're based here in New York City. The office does not appear to be dead in New York at all. People are definitely certainly coming back. At Thalo, we really worry a lot about the base level of the equipment that heats and cools the building. So the things that burn petrochemicals to heat, and a lot of stuff that uses refrigerant to keep us cool, or alternatively hot for a lot of heat pumps. Definitely, we're seeing a very, very specific increased pain on energy savings. And how can we actually save not just money from the pure energy saving standpoint, but also some of the operational pain of making sure all these systems are still operating as not both efficiently, but also from like that tenant call problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly we're seeing a pretty significant bump. I think historically different from the past, of new technical solutions that are coming into what traditionally has been a pretty reluctant market to accept new solutions. Well, these things are getting down in cost and pervasiveness enough so that actually you can take things out of like what we're seeing in power plants and aerospace and other places. It's getting cheap enough to deploy them anywhere. And now we're seeing them kind of come into the built environment, which is really, really exciting to see. So I think the life of the office is rich, but it's becoming, I think, a lot more technically enabled.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that where energy savings was kind of the, the table scraps, that they're really now kind of front and center, right? It used to be, hey, let's worry about everything else, our teams first, and now I think, yeah, you're right. I hear a lot more of, hey, this is some, because that is a cost that you can drive down, right, without negatively impacting the office experience at all. So thank you. Emily, how about you? I know you deal with corporates all the time. Like, what are they talking about when it comes to the office, and what's kind of top of mind?
Yeah. No, great question. And kind of given that we are focused on helping organizations take advantage of flexible real estate, we also have a consulting side of our business that has a sustainability practice and teams that help organizations really implement strategies to incorporate hybrid work. And so interestingly, the side of our business that helps organizations take advantage of agile or flexible space uses, a lot of the data that we see, looking kind of globally, as well as within the US, is that demand continues to increase. And even with all of this discussion around work from home or work from specific headquarters offices, demand is actually up 13% from 2023 to 2024 for the use of flexible office environments, serviced office, kind of private serviced office solutions for anywhere from 2 desks up to, hundreds of desks. So that's actually a big deal, that there's kind of this new use case that's coming into a lot of these buildings. So I think that's actually really important. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of corporate occupiers are now really passionate about incorporating different elements of sustainability and decarbonization efforts into their decision-making processes. And that's new. And the more and more landlords can kind of be prepared with that conversation around what they're doing within their buildings in order to help the occupiers make those decisions about whether or not to choose those buildings, is really critical. So a lot of that is what we're really seeing starting to kind of get some serious traction.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when you look at things globally, that the US is a bit of an outlier, right? When it, but I think that we are slowly kind of coming back in line with, some of the other, particularly Western, Eastern Europe countries, right? Of not fully back to the office, but certainly not, fully remote, right? I think we're seeing that's like
Yeah.
bring quite a bit. Like, people understand that the office and the shared workspace still has value. All right, Elizabeth, how about you? What are you seeing when you're talking to your clients and people in the industry?
Yeah, so at our Zero, our platform and product really starts with devices, and those being occupancy sensors, air quality monitors. And from an occupancy perspective, the data is very telling. So there's data that's showing that there's more volatility within the work week, but we are definitely seeing utilization numbers slowly tick up quarter over quarter, and those being average utilization. But that volatility is something that our customers and clients have accepted and become comfortable with, just understanding that's just natural state of affairs, and this is a part of the hybrid workplace that they've really designed for and accommodated for. And that being a really interesting trend, also just kind of spotting and highlighting other research that we've seen come out associated with organizations kind of settling into their current strategy and saying, all right, we're somewhat done with the right sizing exercise, and now we're really focused on making sure we get as much out of the investments that we've made. And so that being also kind of a transition into the dialogue of, okay, so we are, we're presumably in this space long term. How can we talk to our building operators about some of these energy efficiency and really scope reduction opportunities? So that being something that is a way to bring people to the table, and that being a really interesting trend that we're seeing a ton of appetite for. And we engage with both sides of the house, the operators and the occupiers, and that being an opportunity to kind of bring people to the table.
Yeah, definitely. There's a whole new relationship, right, between occupiers and landlords, which we'll get into in a bit. I want to get in. I know this is about costs, but I think that first I would love to just talk a little bit about the benefit, right? Because they really do play into each other. And I think, again, when you're looking at reducing costs of an office, you have to do so in a way that doesn't reduce the benefit, right? Or else, I think you're really, really shooting yourself in the foot. So, now I think it's a lot harder to really pinpoint the benefit of an office. It used to be productivity, right? How many widgets you built, how many emails could you send, right? But we're so far past that now, right? And so I just kind of want to hear from you guys, what are you hearing about what people are really thinking of the office, right? What is the benefit? And I think, obviously we talked a little bit about sustainability mandates. Like, I think that is part of it too, right? Is setting the corporate culture, right? Letting employees know what's important to an organization. Emily, I'd love to maybe start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think 100% it is about collaboration. It used to be that we designed offices like with these very sort of specific guidelines that said, oh, we're doing X% focus area and we're doing X%, collaboration and X% team rooming. And that world is really different now. And obviously there's regional nuances like you're going to see in other countries where people don't have the luxury of having their own home office or things of that sort where they do need a bit more focus time. But I think by and large, it is 100% now about collaboration. The things that draw people into office, and I talk to clients about this literally every day, the things that draw them in are their leaders and the ability to come together and solve problems together. So it sort of reminds me of the old saying about the 330-300 rule that I think JLL coined way long time ago. But that was essentially that you spend $3 a square foot on utilities, you spend $30 a square foot on rent, and you spend $300 a square foot on payroll. So it is about really focusing on your people and how these spaces are actually driving value for people. So a lot of the metrics are evolving and changing. And instead of looking at things like the cost per square foot, it's what's the cost of my vacancy? What's the value that I'm driving around bringing people together in space? How do I sort of continue to evolve the way we think about that and hold people accountable for it? But that then all ties back into creating a great experience so that when people do come in, they're actually productive and they're doing it for a reason. So, and this isn't something that is just solved by corporate real estate departments. It's really bringing together the whole ecosystem of the business, HR with policy, IT with technology, sustainability teams with really identifying how to kind of align to those goals, in addition to the corporate real estate decisions about space. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
It's a great point. And a collaboration is, everybody loves to say it, right? Oh, collaboration is what you want from the office, but that's such a hard thing to judge too. And I think, the technology seems to be inching closer to being able to track that in maybe a meaningful way, right? Obviously, having the utilization rate doesn't really track it, right? Having someone sit, in an office and look at their phone the whole time isn't exactly collaboration, right? They could have been at home, right? But understanding, using reservation systems, seeing where people sit, right? Seeing where dwell time is in the office. And I think, we are starting to get a lot better, but it is still a pretty fuzzy metric. I don't, I definitely don't envy like corporate occupiers when they have to go, report their benefits to the C-suite, because it's probably pretty tricky. Brendan, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about, what are you hearing about just the use of the office? Like, what is the benefits of the office, and why are corporate occupiers like committed to them? It seems like now.
Honestly, I don't have those conversations all that much, because I'm usually hanging out in the boiler rooms and the rooftops and dealing with the people who are keeping the building running. So, the value, I can speak for my own team. We're all in person all the time because I don't really know how to develop hard tech solutions remotely. And we like it. At least the people who are here seem to like it. You should ask them yourself, I suppose, but I think they like it.
They tell you they like it.
They tell us that's what really matters. But um, maybe taking that in a slightly different way. When we talk to building owner operators, a lot of like when we're talking about energy savings in general, like there's only a few levers you can pull, right? You can basically change the equipment in the buildings, and once you've done the LEDs, you've kind of gotten the main easy one out of the way. You can change how you operate that equipment. So that's based on occupancy or CO2 levels, or you can turn it off at night and you can get a weather forecast in and smooth that curve. And that definitely works. Or you can change the building itself, right? Which is either the envelope of, oh man, all my windows are leaking, change the installation process. Or you can change and make sure that the equipment itself is operating at its peak efficiency. And there's when you look at it, I don't mean to oversimplify this problem, but you have to change something, kind of one of those three, I think, to actually make a meaningful change in the emissions. And when we're talking about people returning to work, really, I think a lot of that is around the operation side. And as I think we've gotten back up to a more reasonable, not quite pre-pandemic level, but in many places close, then it's like, all right, now I'm kind of back to where I was or close to it. Where else can I turn? And that we're definitely hearing a lot about is people are looking for solutions, and and there's a few available, right? And some that are new since pandemic, which is pretty neat.
What about, when you're, just talking about being in the, kind of the boiler room and talking with the operations team in these buildings? Like I've heard from a number of people that, the type of person that does these jobs is starting to change too, right? Where this was more of a maintenance type job. And now because of this new office, there's some hospitality aspect to it, right? Like these are people that are building the environment and the experience, and not just like making sure that things turn on and off, right? Is that what you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, the type of people are changing in many ways, or the type of job that those people have to play is changing. It's definitely becoming more and more technically enabled and required. The component of they're playing an active role within tenant comfort is obviously a high gear. And also just the number of people are changing. A lot of times we'll see people retiring, right? And they're not being replaced necessarily with additional backfill, but now, you started with a team of 20 people operating a building, and a few years later, now it's down to 15, and they don't quite know it as well because that one person who was working there for 40 years and the building may not be there anymore. So I think that this is actually one of the places that new technical solutions, especially with not just more data, but interpretation of the data, where we can kind of help those building owner operators actually be able to be more efficient, act as a tool so that they know what's coming next, rather than still trying to rely on the older models of just throwing people at it. Because I just don't think we have the same number of people, and they're being asked to do increasingly harder and harder tasks.
Yeah, more turnover too, right? I think the older generation was one where they'd stay at their job for 30 years. And I mean, now people switch jobs every 5 years, right? So it's hard to build that one person who is just like the expert of the building like they did before. So that's good insight. Thanks. Elizabeth, how about you? What are you hearing about the kind of the purpose of the office and kind of building the experience that people want?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's interesting what Brendan shared in that smart buildings technology is really a productivity suite of kit of parts for the operators and the engineers in the building. So you are delivering productivity just to a different stakeholder, a different user. And kind of hinging on what Emily shared in the 330-300 construct, we talk about this often, and it was always that 3 is very tangible, the utilities, and that's very easy to kind of pinpoint and target as a cost savings measure. The 30 is pretty meaty, you can get into utilization practices, but the 300 is as a metric is kind of the golden nugget. And you have productivity that was kind of leveled up to effectiveness, and this is even more intangible of how do we actually measure this. But absolutely productivity and effectiveness are the most important elements, because the office wouldn't exist if people didn't have a reason to come in. And So similarly, collaboration is a very, popular trend. And I think also tying back to what I shared earlier, there's just more volatility again in the use of space types where there's, a lot of demand for enclosed focus space as well as, a more casual ad hoc collaborative space that you can really make those, aha moments occur and just casual check-ins that have nothing to do with work. Which, I think anecdotally, as people share, that's really the true value is getting back to a social construct around work. And as opposed to, this regimented Zoom schedule where you have to have like a prescribed subject matter for each meeting. So we also kind of think about this domain of the experience of being in a space into areas where you're experiencing others, but you're experiencing the environment also. And this kind of relates back to something Brendan shared about measuring comfort and making sure that the comfort of the environment is consistent, it's predictable, is potentially fine-tuned by individuals so that they can, choose based on certain readings like noise or light levels. And these are things that we talk to our customers about and getting into, all of these kind of comfort element measurement domains, even just the simplicity of temperature and humidity. People might not feel humidity, but or cognitively perceive that they're feeling humidity, but that has an impact on productivity ultimately, absolutely CO2 and these other elements that I think building operators are starting to get tuned into. One, just based on the nuisance of like dealing with comfort complaints, but then also, from a well and certification perspective, occupiers and just the people who work within those space really do qualify those certifications as more valuable to them than something like a sustainability certification, because that's more for the business. So
Right.
we're seeing those all kind of play out in customer interactions and trends.
And you guys deal a lot with occupancy sensors, right? Which obviously can do a lot for energy reduction, right? But I also think that they are being used, quite a bit to understand office utilization in a way. When the pandemic, first ended, people first started coming back to the office. I think there was a lot of kind of hand wringing over, oh, geez, things are empty Monday and Friday, right? Like everyone's kind of stacking their office visits in the middle of the week. Do you still sense that, or is it are maybe corporate occupiers okay with having empty offices a little bit, right? As long as they kind of hit their metrics of helping productivity, collaboration, all those other things.
Yeah, we're definitely still seeing that in the data, but the corporate occupiers have accepted that as the norm, and this is one of the elements that brings this data point to the fore for operators and saying, all right, if we can drive ventilation based on the actual dynamic occupancy, real-time occupancy trends within the office, then this could be a win-win for both tenant and operator, from a cost as well as a reporting perspective. And that's what we're starting to see play out and bringing the two to the table together. But yeah, definitely still playing out.
Yeah, and I think it drives home the importance of this technology, right? When that fluctuation of occupancy, I think, is exactly what allows the technology to help, save energy and do all this. If it was just, equal occupancy, then not much you can do. It is,
Yep. If I can add to something that you just mentioned, Elizabeth, because I think what really is kind of some interesting kind of new connective tissue over all of these ideas is that concept of choice. And I think also the fact that employees kind of now have an awareness of a lot of these elements that maybe they didn't really have post-COVID. Like you never heard of somebody bringing their own CO2 meter into a space, and that's actually now a thing. And so, obviously done right, this kind of does create that win-win across the board. But interestingly, like when you talk about individuals having choice of where they can work, whether it's within a footprint of, a specific leased area, or whether it is in, different buildings, I think that's kind of another element here, that it's even more important to be talking to the end users and the employees about the value that they're creating when they're making those more energy efficient choices, and that it actually is helping them personally. Like, we did talk about the CO2. And post COVID, people got a lot smarter around learning what levels were dangerous and might have, too much potential for absorbing viruses. I'm probably saying those words incorrectly. But then, even beyond that, it's things like sound and, optimal decibel levels being, around 45, whatever the metric is. But essentially, like, I think these end users are learning this and
Yeah.
are realizing that if they can make those better choices in some of those spaces, or be in buildings where the operators of those buildings are showing that they actually want to create solutions that support the individual as well as, the company goals, I think that truly is sort of creating that win-win across the spectrum. So I think it's kind of fascinating that you guys are getting into a lot of that right now, because I think that seems like that's going to continue.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we're early innings, it seems like, right? There's lots
Yeah.
more that can be done. So, all right, well, let's get into the bulk of this, right? I think, when we think about costs reduction, right, it's usually trying to bring the energy bill down, right? And a lot of money gets wasted. I mean, I've seen, metrics as much as 30%, right? And you don't know what that 30% is, right? A lot of it is just kind of like, phantom wasted energy. So maybe let's talk about some of the technologies that are being brought on, both the ones that are, somewhat well used right now, like occupancy sensors, and maybe some of the kind of newer ones that can really help corporate occupiers and landlords understand their energy use better. Brendan, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I love talking about this, as we talk about this all the time. I do, just on that last point, by the way, I always like, somebody said the other day, is like, you're not actually competing with the other office buildings. You're competing with the fact that people just sat at home for 3 years, and your tenant comfort is really high at home. So you can go turn the temperature to whatever you want. Air quality is pretty nice. You don't have too many coworkers. Maybe you have an animal-based coworker that is causing problems, but other than that, it's like pretty nice. And of course, now we're all coming back. It's like, wow, that's actually what we're competing with. It's actually not the building next door. It's going home, and that's a pretty high bar to cross, actually. So that's, I think, exactly why a lot of these new tools can help.
Mhm.
You know, I kind of mentioned before, there's only, I at risk of oversimplifying it, there's basically three ways you can cut costs. Is you can, change your equipment so that it is more effective and easier. You can change to something. Sometimes you can change the equipment to something that might cost even more in the short term, particularly if it's an electrically loaded project, but is better in the longer term, or has a significant environmental improvement. You can change how you operate it. That is oftentimes, like the occupancy stuff, that really does work. But it doesn't work if your equipment is not operating efficiently, right? Like if you've lost 30% of your charge on your heat pump, doesn't matter how you turn it on and off, it's never going to get effective. And I think that actually is becoming more and more prevalent as we talk to the engineers and the building operators. That they're like, yeah, I'm telling it to work, but it doesn't matter. The compressor's on the whole time. Like, yeah, exactly. And that gets into that like sort of next level of understanding of your building. And of course, the building itself, that envelope. How can I improve that in some particular way? For us, a lot of what we do is we take this sort of technologies that are available to regulated sectors, or like power and aerospace, places where you'd spend a lot of money to make sure you never are leaking refrigerant. And now with a lot of advances in tech, particularly on the sensing side and the compute side on device, you can bring those down and make them so now, you would never do that in a building if it cost $1 million, because you'll never make the money back. But now if suddenly it's a few grand, that could pay back in a year. And it's better. It's like more pleasant to work with. So that's obviously a trend that we're seeing, and we love being part of that trend as we take into different pieces of other industries and bringing them into the built environment. I also have one trend, which is we don't do anything in, but I love talking about it, is the concept of a pure efficiency from reuse of something that we've used to just throw out. So for example, I'm seeing a lot of, particularly here in New York, installations of like hot water reuse. So there's this one company, which name escapes me right now, but all of the water in your building, in a large building, is about its room temperature. All the stuff in the sinks and the toilets is about room temperature, and the water coming in is not. And if you could do a heat exchanger, you actually can become incredibly efficient at just actually saving a bunch of energy and effort, basically for free for the cost of the equipment. So I'm seeing a lot of like really cool, innovative solutions around just being a little bit smarter with, for example, are we just wasting all that heat? Could we reuse that in some way? Could we add economizers and efficiency improvements just by thinking a little bit more strategically about how we're throwing away our heat or throwing away our cool? And I think that that's going to be really cool, because if you can go and have magic boxes that can cut 10, 20, 30% of your emissions and your energy bill down, holy moly, let's get those in right now, right? On our path to getting to full net zero buildings.
Yeah, no, I think those are, a lot of really cool new ideas like that coming out. I think what sometimes hinders, the adoption is that they're a big pull, right? I think the kind of low hanging fruit of, okay, install a software and it'll kind of make your energy bills go down. A lot of companies have already done that, right? A lot of landlords have already done that. Probably not enough, but a lot of them have, right? And so now we're getting into, okay, where's your investment? Like, where are you actually going to go and invest in some infrastructure? And that's where it can, I think, get expensive, right? Or maybe even not so much expensive as daunting, right? For a building owner or operator who isn't experienced in this kind of stuff, doesn't really know, and you guys have seen every vendor obviously says everything, what they sell is going to pay back in the shortest amount of time possible, right? And so I think, once bitten, twice shy, there's a little bit of that going around, right? Of like, oh, well, we tried that and it didn't work as much as it could have, but there's certainly still a lot more to be done. Elizabeth, I'm interested to hear from you. Like, what are some of the new technologies coming online that you think are really starting to get adopted and move the needle in offices?
Yeah, I mean, I think surprisingly, we're still in an energy benchmarking domain. And so even what we talk about of occupancy-based demand control ventilation is somewhat novel, and having air quality as a backstop for air quality monitoring, as backstop for comfort, making sure that you're not sacrificing comfort at any turn or any moment within the building. I think there's a lot of novel software-based approaches to optimizing buildings just purely from a software perspective. Just like digital testing of equipment is surprisingly has a very high cost impact on buildings, based on the way they had manually done this previously. And this was something that I learned just on the job, in process. And so some of those things that I think have been discovery by those who've been in the domain for a very long time have added those modules to their platform, and it's been the top performer, just reporting on comfort across the building to get ahead of complaints and things like this that may not be the obvious champion use case, but those are the ones that are enabling the purchaser to make the buying decision because it solves a pain point. So that's kind of what we're seeing is typically you have your land use case and the really meaty one. I think also there's some novel business models out there, sales models that are starting to take new form of pricing in different ways that's more advantageous for the customer, for the buyer, so that they can, finance over time and whatnot. So that is where technology vendors have to get creative in meeting the customer where they're at, really. And this is the corporate real estate market, and meeting the market where it's at right now.
Yeah, we did a whole webinar about financing solutions and green financing, and it's dizzying. There are so many options, right? When you add up CPACE and all of the Inflation Reduction Act has a bunch of kind of financing options. So I think there probably will be some hand holding there as well, like you say, to kind of help owners understand how to make these investments, right? How to finance these investments.
Yeah, we've even seen like technology vendors going directly to the utilities and negotiating their own crediting system, which is kind of fascinating that the utility would come to the table and get to that level of detail for a smaller technology vendor. But it's, it has the promise to make incremental enough impact on grid resiliency, which is ultimately the much larger problem that we're all facing.
Yeah, and I've always been interested about this because there's such a skew between utilities, right? I think, when you look at like, New York, they've done a pretty good job of having their utilities be able to talk with buildings, right? Having kind of data go back and forth pretty easily, but it seems like they're still the outlier, right? I think there are still a lot of places in the US. It's not only about, what kind of green power they have or how they're producing their power, but like how can you actually tap into some of these data networks? I mean, Elizabeth, based on what you're seeing, is this progress? Are we starting to see maybe some of the less sophisticated utilities starting to at least develop these technologies that can do that?
Yes, and I think even from a higher level, from a federal level, having appetite to revisit the permitting process for new alternative energy or new infrastructure projects on the grid, which is ultimately the largest bottleneck in net new energy generation. And so that being a promising indicator that we're all kind of pushing our sleeves up and trying to solve problems bit by bit at our little stop in the value chain.
Mm-hmm. Emily, obviously you don't deal directly with energy, but I know that obviously connecting offices and making them more kind of technologically efficient is a big part of what you guys do consult on. So, what have you seen as far as new technologies to come in and help save energy, but also probably make for better experience as well?
Yeah, well, a lot of it, again, kind of taking it back to the use cases for individuals and for buildings. Technology is playing a really important role in helping people connect with place. And I think that is going to continue to be needed. And I think it's also kind of where you sort of become this ecosystem of solutions that actually the energy savings element of it and going into buildings that are actually kind of focused on that contributes to, uh, the choice that individuals have. And I think a lot of that is starting to happen. I think you're seeing it in terms of whether it is kind of desk booking systems that can be applied both within an organization's portfolio or within a portfolio, plus using third-party spaces, whether it's in co-working and serviced office. Interestingly, I think the users are now kind of interested in what experience they're going to get within that space, whether it is down to kind of like the thermal comfort, can I dim the lights? Am I going to be, close to natural light, whatever that might be. So I think all of these things are converging a bit, which is a really interesting sort of, phenomenon about where it needs to go. A lot of occupiers that have a lot of office space have practiced with things like shutting down certain floors of those buildings based on the data that they're getting out of those technologies. And if they shut down those floors, can it make a significant impact on a lot of their energy costs and operational costs? And so I think a lot of those technologies that can connect those dots are the ones that are really rising to the top, because organizations want to be able to utilize different tools for their employees to kind of really understand where space is adding value, where employees are choosing it, and then what's the benefit that the company can take from that. So I think it's kind of half about utilization, half about booking, and or maybe a third utilization, a third booking, and a third really about helping to support the collaboration and the goals that the organization has on how to bring people together. So I see a lot of this converging, and our team at the Instant Group has launched a sustainability index for operators of co-working and serviced office space, kind of for that reasons, because our clients have said to us, we want to know where we can make choices in buildings that actually are contributing to our goals. And that is new. The same thing is now happening on the well side, and we've worked with the IWBI to put together a co-working rating for well, because a lot of these smaller operators, they either lease a space within a building or they have a management agreement with a landlord, and they don't have a lot of ability to kind of make a lot of changes within that space. So starting with something is really powerful and valuable. So I think kind of connecting some of these new uses for space in buildings and tying it all back together within the ecosystem is where technology is really making that happen and creating that connectivity.
Yeah, and that segues honestly perfectly into our next little topic here, which I think what's interesting to me is that it's not fully a technical problem, right? Some of this is a problem just because of the way that the alignments of incentives work. I know ULI came out with a study recently that showed that one of the biggest hindrances for technology adoption and decarbonization, particularly technology, is this misalignment of incentives. It's actually not a misalignment of incentives, because I think the occupiers and the landlords both want the same thing, right? But when you look at the relationship, the historical relationship between the two, it has been very much, okay, you pay for that, we pay for this. And I think sometimes these decarbonization upgrades, it kind of a gray area, right? Where obviously the corporate occupier could benefit from them. The landlord maybe doesn't want to, spend the money. The occupier doesn't want to have to come out of pocket for something that's not their building, right? So what are you guys seeing as maybe ways to bridge that gap? Like, is the landlord occupier relationship changing a bit? Are we able to kind of maybe rejigger the way that these work in order to be able to do these really important upgrades on buildings? Emily, I'll stick with you on this one.
Yeah, and I think actually what Brendan you were saying about new innovative ways to help landlords kind of figure out how do they sort of reuse some of that waste, whether it is water or whether it is heating or cooling. I think it is kind of that's going to be a huge unlock to make it easier for landlords to actually consider investments that they need to make in buildings if there's new innovative ways of making it less costly. So I think that I'm kind of fascinated with that one, because that's really been needed. I think that's going to be interesting to see sort of where that goes. But the second one, in terms of just the alignment of incentives, as occupiers of space have really gone more toward needing a lot more flexibility, that has translated quite a bit into shorter lease terms. So that creates even more pressure on the landlord, and really requires that the landlord be thinking about a lot of these alternative methods for how they can kind of get the infrastructure up to where it needs to be, so that they can provide a lot of these types of tools and solutions down to the individual level, like the demand control on on ventilation or whatever it might be, so that can really drive that tenant comfort. So I just see this as all of these pieces are now kind of being forced to find different ways to work together. Yeah, Brendan, I'd love to hear if you're actually seeing that happen successfully, because I think that the demand is going to drive that these different solutions come into play.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting time. A lot of time we make some really new tech. We have IP, we make patents, and a lot of times we're talking that the creativity all has to come down to how do we align the incentives and make this easy to say yes to, right? Because like at risk of making it like, look what I have on my wrist. We don't have this in any of the buildings. It's insane that we don't have more information. That's wild. So it's not actually a technical challenge in many cases. It's just that we're presenting this like really challenging, like, oh, I'm going to rip out all my boilers and this is going to cost me this much money and I'll never pay it back. It's like, that's a hard conversation to have at this,
Yeah.
right? Like,
What's your
and also,
rebuttal?
and I don't have, oftentimes we're asking people to not, with vanishingly little data, and I mean data not from like the hangover of getting a gas bill a month after it happened, but from like real time, like how is this actually operating? And how can I predict how this is going to operate in the future? With vanishingly little data and little to go on, we're asking a lot of our built environment friends to make some pretty like expensive moves. So I think that a lot of these cool things where it's either just like easier, where like you can get like a lot of your data because it's like pretty easy to install, whether that's a financial easy or just a physical easy, right? It's like, okay, I'll put this on and I don't have to rev everything, but suddenly I'll start understanding how my upgrade path will look as time progresses. Definitely we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that that's great, right? Because like it's sort of, I of course I'm on the side of the technology developer. The thing that we are like hyper concerned about is how easy can we make this for someone to say yes? And if it's cheap enough and it saves you money and it saves you operational pain, right? And probably money in many ways, well, of course, is the topic of our conversation, is the canonical example of probably a vitamin, right? You know, you want to sell painkillers or vitamins. It's like saving money is good, but if it's a huge pain in the butt to do that, or if I have to put a bunch of money up front to eventually save money, that's hard. That's not an easy sell. If we can get to the point where you're solving a painkiller type problem, or that vitamin is really easy to take down, that I think is I think the most aligned part. And of course, oftentimes when people are selling sustainability options, they're not selling vitamins or painkillers, they're selling croissants, which are nice to have when
Right.
Yeah.
you are, not on a diet and not having trouble. But if you're selling croissants at a time when people are in real pain, well, I think we might be selling it slightly the wrong way.
Elizabeth, what about you? What are you seeing as far as this kind of relationship, and how is it, changing based on all of this, new tech that's coming in?
Yeah. I think this is one that really gets back to the pricing strategy. And, we hear 3 to 5 year ROI often from both tenants and operators, but I think realistically, we have to target a much shorter ROI period to get technology adopted, en masse and at a time scale that is meaningful for businesses and their growth. I think there are, as a IoT vendor, there's a lot of request for just the hardware and taking the data and dealing with the data separately, really, because there's a ton of layering of cost when you have multiple technology vendors. And so that's a piece of it as well, that has to be considered. But of course, penalties are supporting the costing strategy and the ROI strategy in a huge way, because you can add those into the ROI model, and that starts to stack up and cut down years on an ROI within a facility in New York City, for example. And so these pressures from legislature and municipalities are really facilitating the adoption of technology for a first time, because they're requiring it. They're requiring the reporting. We know around ESG reporting really kind of coming due this coming year, and in year-over-year reporting, and that's going to start showing up in annual reports. So all of these combined are contributing to one, requirements, as well as desire and the ask from those occupiers. And I think it's LEED is telling that LEED is adding a significant number of points around IAQ in the coming V5. And that is really born out of, a lot of research and a lot of customer intent around that. And, I think coming out of the pandemic, the conversation around health of spaces became somewhat taboo and people didn't want to talk about it anymore, but it's changing it's shifting focus a little bit right now into this really ties back to the productivity and effectiveness conversation. And the IAQ is really only important when it's in context with, occupancy events. High CO2 doesn't really matter if it's spiking when nobody's there. It's still an operator's problem, but yeah.
Especially
So
when IAQ and energy efficiency oftentimes have, pulling in different directions. Yeah.
Absolutely. But like using that as a backstop, because of course, like nobody's going to sacrifice comfort first, because that's the biggest value driver of buildings at large, is the people who come and occupy those spaces on a daily basis.
Got a question here that you already kind of answered a bit, but it's, are you seeing new regulatory requirements that are in place in New York City motivate owners to act? Are you seeing the investment or the Inflation Reduction Act incentives helping move the needle, to implement these improvement measures? And I'm going to add one other piece of this is like, what about energy prices, right? Is that like, obviously these are nice and these are pushing out, but, regulatory requirements, that's isolated, right? That's like Denver, New York, Maryland, a couple spaces. Inflation Reduction Act obviously can bring some money to the table and help make these, but I don't think it, makes the business case any different. But, those things combined seem to be helping. And do you think like eventually rising energy prices will be, that last kind of stake that really motivates even like the laggards that don't want to, invest anything in their buildings? I'll start. Let's stay with you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so the rising energy prices is something that we talk about in Discovery. That's not as much top of mind because it's not a problem that they're solving for immediately in the next 12 months, but it's certainly part of the impending doom conversation, right? Is like, this is why we're talking about it, because ultimately this is going to cost you more and more over time if you don't invest in efficiency measures. And I think more significantly, it's the municipalities that are driving the penalties that are top of mind for operators, as opposed to the opportunities with the IRA and the like. And that's just really what we're seeing on the ground. Yeah, so I think those are probably the
Brendan,
two.
what about you? Are you seeing the same thing? I mean, do you get more demand from these places that have these reporting requirements?
One of the reasons that we're based in New York, in addition to the beautiful people and the beautiful pizzas, is because we have Local 97. We have the first carbon fine structure on the planet. For those of you not aware of Local 97, I'm sure everybody has some idea of this. It's the first carbon fine. So any building over a certain size that's emitting more than its fair share of CO2 equivalent based on its scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, starting this year, 2024 reporting year, will get fined if it's over its limits starting next year. And kind of a lot of money if you're following carbon prices, $268 per metric ton. This affects a relatively small number of buildings, pretty bad emitters to start, 10, 15% of the building stock here in New York. These levels go dramatically down in 2029 and 5 years from now. So sounds hard to say that that's only 5 years. And that will affect a much larger panoply of the building stock. Of course, with IRA, we have, we've been like trying to use carrots for, 30 years in sustainability, and they kind of work, not really that well. They don't really work to get pervasive into like LMI communities, low middle income communities and other places. And And then we can sometimes use sticks, which are regulated environments. And I think we're all in general heading towards a more regulated building sector, definitely.
Mhm.
Local 097 is somewhere, it's kind of like a carrot being used as a stick. We have found that the best value for us, like a lot of our customers come to us trying to not have local 97 fines either now or in 5 years.
Mhm.
And oftentimes they're looking for a path, not just like to fix it now, but like, how do I get out of this in the future? And
Mhm.
what we have found, honestly, the best part of it for us has been that it solves the education problem, because there's not a building owner, operator, engineer that doesn't know in New York City how much they're getting fined, what's their scope 1, what's their scope 2, when, so they know all of this. And we don't ever have to explain that. We come in with like, hey, we have a thing for that problem. And they're like, great, what do you got? That's not the same in places in California and other places where that law has not been indicated. It is in places where it hasn't yet come out, like Boston, like many younger, more annoying siblings, has cut and pasted Local 97 and is rolling out Berto 2.0 somewhat soon. They also know all about their emissions statement. So it definitely works. Like, it's definitely been pushing buildings in the right direction. Some would argue it is not pushing it hard enough, and should be going even faster. Many in the real estate industry think that it is entirely an overburden.
Mhm.
But I think that educational thing has unlocked. I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of cool new tech is actually getting in, is because people are like willing to be like prodded a little bit and
Mhm.
look to like say, all right, what is out there now? Is it just I got to replace the boiler, I got to get a new BMS, or can I look to like, where can I shave another 10, 20, 30% off? And I think that if everybody shaved 20% of their emissions and therefore their energy bill off, that would be a pretty meaningful reduction overall. And that's, I think, a really good way of thinking about it. It allows everyone to get out of the rut and start thinking about what one foot can I put in front of the other to get there, rather than this whole scale, let's get to net zero next year. And I think
Yeah.
that pragmatism is incredibly encouraging, because it actually does move the needle.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just pie in the sky stuff. Emily, I'll have to end with you on this one. We're getting to the end of our time here, but I just wanted to know, from your perspective, you obviously deal with, corporates that have portfolios all over the country, right? So do these pockets of, different sort of requirements, did they move the needle on an entire portfolio, right? Do you see occupiers that maybe are in New York that are like, hey, we might as well just report on this, or kind of, take ourselves to that standard across our entire portfolio? It's just easier that way. Or is it still like, okay, New York will do that and Denver will do that?
Well, interestingly, more and more, and obviously this has been going on in Europe longer than it has here in the US, but more and more US based companies are realizing that they actually need to be a part of the solution. They're occupiers of the space. They need to also be demanding that emissions data from their landlords, from those buildings. And
Mhm.
they're starting to do it now because they have these requirements within the
Mhm.
reporting. So it's happening. I do think that the pull that happens by the users of that space, that they are going to drive a lot of the movement where landlords are realizing that they have to do it as well. So it's here. It's not just okay. I'll do it in that building because I can get that information. It's how do I get this information for everywhere, every part of my portfolio, whether or not it is considered scope 1 or 2. I need to know, I need to have that data so that I can kind of report on it from a more broad perspective. So I think especially publicly traded companies, they have to do it now. So they are going to pull it. And I think that'll also be a big driver of making sure that, these buildings get to where they need to go.
Yeah, certainly a new paradigm, right? When you're comparing a cost of doing something, a large, infrastructure project, with the cost of having a vacant building, like, I think most people would
Absolutely.
choose to do the investment, at least to get, some cash flow coming in. Well, this has been great. We're at the end of our time already. That flew by. So I think it was a really great discussion. I hope everybody enjoyed it. If anybody would like to connect with any of our panelists here, I would be happy to make that connection. You can send me an email. It's franco@propmoto.com. That's FRANCO @propmoto.com. I just want to thank Elizabeth, Emily, Brendan. Thank you guys so much. And yeah, have a great rest of the week.